Good afternoon, everyone. I think we can get started with our webinar today. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon to have a conversation around the Pell Grant program. ACCT is excited to offer 3 webinars as we get prepared for the 117th Congress and as we continue our advocacy and support for the Pell Grant program. The 3 webinars that we'll be covering is this first one today that you're joining us on is increasing the Pell Grant maximum. And the second one will be November 12th. That will be on short-term Pell. And the third and final one will be December 3rd, which will be on second chance Pell. So please, I encourage you to join us for each of those Pell Grant webinars as we build and continue support this vital program for our students and our institutions. We're joined by 3 individuals, so I will we'll go through and introduce our speakers, and then I'll introduce our moderator. Carrie Warick is Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for the National College Attainment Network. Also known as NCAN. Ironically, I only say NCAN. It's very hard to remember all the acronyms out there. We're also joined by Ayman Mendoza, who's a college advisor at the USC College Advising Corps. Ayman is a former community college student of ours from Southern California and also a Pell recipient. And his other claim to fame is that he was a former intern of a public policy office the previous summer. So Ayman, thank you. And I'm so happy to see you again. We're also joined by Cherly Pierre, who's the Director of Financial Aid Operations at Broward College in Florida. Also joining us from Florida, temporarily, is Jose Miranda, who's our Senior Government Relations Associate, who's part of our ACCT team. And Jose, I'll turn it over to you to get started on our presentation.
Thank you, Ji-Hang, and thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you once again for joining us in this very important discussion around the need to increase the maximum award for the Pell Grant. On screen, you will find a few housekeeping items that we'd like you to keep in mind as you participate. All of our viewers are currently participating in listen-only mode, but if you have a question for any of our panelists, please post your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as we can during our time together. If there's a question that's similar to your own or you really want answered, go ahead and give it a thumbs up in the Q&A section so we know not to miss it. Now, before we get to hear from our wonderful panel, I'd like to share some general data about the Pell Grant program and why we advocate for an increase to the maximum award. Pell Grants have been around since 1972, when it was established during the amendments to the Higher Education Act. The Pell Grant program was championed by Rhode Island Senator Claiborne Pell, which is why the name comes from. And as to why it matters for us, community colleges serve roughly the same amount of Pell recipients as 4-year public institutions. When we talk about the rising cost of higher education, a lot of talk is centered around tuition. And while tuition has been rising significantly over the past decades, there's also additional costs that are incurred to our students when they enroll in higher education. Costs such as housing, transportation, technology, and other living expenses that our students need to find the funds for in order to remain in school. While community colleges have a lower tuition cost, generally speaking, the living expenses for a student in any general area are going to be the same whether you're in a 4-year institution or in a 2-year public institution. There is aid available for students right now. The 3 primary buckets that the federal government provides are Pell Grants, which we'll be discussing today, student loans, and federal work study. However, Pell Grants are the only of the 3 buckets, the only set of funds from the 3 buckets that do not need to be repaid back or require students to work on campus in order to acquire the funds. While these 3 buckets are there and are available for students in order to access higher education, there is still an aid deficit for many of our students today. According to 2016 data, on average, students had about $7,000 in unmet need after accounting for their expected family contributions and grant aid. Nearly 3/4 of community college students are faced with unmet financial need to cover the full cost of tuition, fees, and other living expenses. Currently, even without grant aid, many students are left with unmet need, which lead to students, particularly community students who are loan adverse and do not often tap into student loans, unable to enroll full time or unable to continue their education. There has been congressional talk about strengthening the Pell Grant program and particularly increasing the maximum award of the Pell Grant. Over the past couple of years, the Appropriations Committee has successfully increased the maximum award roughly by around $100 to $150 each year, which accounts for the purchase for maintaining the program with the current rate of inflation. The House Democrats introduced last year the College Affordability Act, which was their proposal for a Higher Education Act reauthorization bill, and in it they included a modest one-time increase of $625 to the maximum Pell Award and indexing the award to inflation moving forward. With this, the maximum award would automatically rise to over $8,460 over the next decade. In addition to the higher education proposal by House Democrats and the annual appropriations increase that we've seen over the past couple of years, there's also a lot of different standalone bills by different members proposing to increase the maximum award of Pell, ranging from small modest increase like the College Affordability Act to much ambitious proposals for the award. ACCT as an organization, we are advocating for an increase to the maximum award without necessarily advocating for a specific amount. We believe the appropriators it is the appropriators' job to figure that out. And we also want to make sure that when the appropriators do that, they take into account other ways that we can strengthen the Pell Grant that would also require additional funds, such as the two other provisions that we'll see in our Pell series, such as Second Chance Pell and Short-Term Pell. Now, with this brief general overview of where we stand with the Pell Grant, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful panelists. And we'll start with Ms. Cherly Pierre, who is the Financial Aid Director at Broward College. Cherly?
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm happy to be here to share some of the perspective from community college as it relates to the Pell Grant program. As we know, it's currently with the COVID-19, and as Jose beautifully explained, there has been some gap in what relates to cost of attendance. The cost of attendance has increased, not per se tuition, but the cost of attendance such as room and board and transportation has increased over the years. However, Pell has not seen a significant increase over the years. So back in 2009, when we had the Great Recession, we have seen some changes as it relates to the Pell Grant. One of which, if I may, is in 2000, during the Great Recession, we've seen that enrollment increases. Usually when enrollment increases, there is higher need for aid. Therefore, once enrollment increase, students are relying upon a federal grant and to assist with the cost of attendance. So back in 2009, there was a rising from 15.6 million enrollment in fall 2007 to a peak of 18.1 million in fall 2010. So over the years after fall 2010, we've seen a decline of enrollment starting from 2011 till present. However, the cost of attendance is still increasing across the nation. So one of the things that is dear to me and we pay close attention to is gap. We look at to see the average cost, the average Pell that a student receiving, usually a student in the age of 19 to 25, they're receiving a certain amount of Pell, but it's not enough to cover. So they receive an average Pell of $2,300 up to $3,000, depending upon their income, but that is not sufficient to cover the cost of attendance. So I'm very happy to share, to be part of this panelist to elaborate further on the advantage of increasing the Pell Grant Award to reflect the increase of cost of attendance. And I'm going to hand it back to you, Jose. Thank you.
Thank you, Cherly. Thank you very much for your insight. We look forward to hearing more from you as we go into the panel. Now I'll turn it over to Ayman Mendoza, who is our resident former community college student and Pell recipient.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ayman Mendoza, pronouns he, him, and his. I am a first generation college graduate from Cerritos Community College and the University of California, Irvine. I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this webinar, and would like to thank ACCT for putting this event together and giving me the opportunity to speak. I currently work for USC College Advising Corps. As a college advisor, I proudly serve at Felicitas and Mendez High School in Boyle Heights, California. One of my job roles is to assist high school students with the whole college process, from applying to college, applying to FAFSA, the California Dream Act application, reading and reviewing their college aid awards with students and families. So as I get near to completing my first year as a college advisor, this past March and April, I witnessed many of my students being accepted to highly competitive schools such as UC Berkeley, San Jose State University, San Francisco State University, UCLA, UC Irvine, I'm sorry. So what do all these students have in common? A huge portion of these students chose not to attend these highly competitive institutions due to the lack of financial aid that they were being given by the federal government. Just like my students, myself, I was scheduled to attend a four-year university coming straight out of high school. I was scheduled to attend four-year Costa LA, California State University, Los Angeles. But soon after learning about how much financial aid I was going to be receiving, I was fearful of taking out student loans because my Pell grant wasn't sufficient to cover my financial needs. So soon after that, I decided to pursue my educational endeavors at a community college. As I went through my education, I didn't take out any student loans at all, but that's not the case for many students. From what I've witnessed, from my personal experience, and from working with students for this past year, I have been able to witness how many students defer from pursuing higher education due to the high amount of cost. You know, it's not just tuition, but housing as well. When you review these award letters, you see that tuition could cost you about, depending on what school you attend, about $8,000 to $14,000, correct? But then you have the additional cost of housing, especially in states such as California. That the cost of living in California is much higher than other states in our country. So with that being said, I am really excited to share more about my experience and share more about the importance of having to increase the Pell Grant maximum.
Thank you very much, Ayman. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carrie.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Thank you so much to ACCT for having me join today. My name is Carrie Warick. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the National College Attainment Network, or you may have heard of us as the National College Access Network, as we just changed our name in February, so we're not at a year yet, to reflect the importance of both access and completion in higher education. NCAN is a membership association for a wide variety of groups in our field. Our founding members in 1995, and still the majority of our members, are college access programs that work directly with students who are from low-income backgrounds, students of color, or students who are first in their family who go to college. And we have about 450 members nationwide, including the College Advising Corps, which is the umbrella organization for the USC Advising Corps, as well as several others. And we have growing membership among institutions of higher education and K-12 school districts as we work in that transition space between K-12 and higher education. NCAN primarily focuses our federal policy work on the areas where our members are working with their students. So that includes our top two priorities of FAFSA simplification and doubling the Pell Grant, because our members are almost universally working with students when they're completing the FAFSA form and reviewing their financial aid offers to decide where to go to college. So Jose, during his presentation, touched on a couple of statistics that kind of tell a very similar story to what we internally refer to as the pie chart graph, because it's like the one and only that makes such a, what I think is a strong argument for why NCAN supports doubling the Pell Grant. So you can see the historic high in 1975-76, which is kind of not the first year of the program, but shortly after, when Congress really got the Pell Grant program fully funded and off the ground, and how it covered nearly 80% of a bachelor's degree. And that we are now seeing that it's only at 28%. And we are proposing, and the reason that we kind of landed on double Pell is that students should be able to afford a public four-year institution. And a little later, I'm going to talk about some of our other affordability research that touches a little more specifically on community colleges, but wanted to provide this kind of this historical context for where we are with the Pell Grant, and share finally that, when we first started advocating for increasing the Pell Grant, we were very focused on what we thought Congress would actually do, what might be politically acceptable. And we had this far more complicated plan that would increase the Pell Grant 10% a year over 10 years, so that by the end we would get to double. And we had our last in-person Hill Day the first week in March, right before kind of everything shut down in the country. And we had a lot of students, both from 2-year and 4-year institutions, pushing back that they could not wait 10 years for that investment. So, that was feedback that we took to heart. And then shortly thereafter, as the COVID crisis hit, the adjoining economic downturn, and then coupled with the social justice conversations and the racial justice conversations that are that began in the spring, we moved to call that no, we need to immediately double the Pell Grant, because we can no longer ask students to wait for these numbers to catch up.
Thank you, Carrie. And just before we move on to the questions that I have planned for you, just a couple of other items. There was a question asked if we would share the PowerPoint with the audience. We'll be emailing it after this presentation is over to anyone that registered. If there are any additional questions or follow-up questions that you have after we've gone over the questions that we prepared, or if we run out of time, feel free to reach out to us. This will also be shared, so these links, as well as additional advocacy work that ACCT has prepared for you all as you continue advocating for student needs and for additional need for Pell Grant recipients and many others. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, and we will go over and start with the Q&A. So the first question that I have is going to be for all of you, and I'll ask you to start us off, because I think you probably have the most personal touch. Why is there a need to increase the maximum award of Pell?
Yes, so students in our country deserve the opportunity to pursue higher education without the fear of detrimental debt. Students should be allowed to complete their studies without having to take on extreme measures, such as working 2 to 3 jobs in order to pay for their college expenses. From my personal experience as well, it was really overwhelming completing my bachelor's degree, just having to work multiple jobs, given that I couldn't, the money that I was receiving for my Pell Grant wasn't enough. especially when I decided to move move out of my hometown. I decided to leave my hometown and move to college. So that change brought in a lot of expenses, from gas, from having to travel back home, from having to pay for housing. I was living in Orange County, being one of the highest rates with living costs. So it is really it's highly important for us to start, working more towards increasing the maximum Pell Grant, because the cost of living nowadays just keeps increasing day by day, and we need to make a change.
Thank you, Ayman. Carrie, passing over the question to you, same question. Why is there a need to increase the maximum award of Pell?
Thank you, Jose. As I mentioned earlier, NCAN does a report every year called The Growing Gap, focused on college affordability. I put the link in the chat box. I will say, apologies, our website's being a little slow today because the host server is having some problems, but that is the host URL for the research, which includes an institution by institution Tableau dashboard where you can check out where your state falls on our affordability measure. And our affordability measure is based on the average Pell Grant recipient attending either a 4-year in-state institution and living on campus, or a community college student, again, attending in-state but living off campus. And we purposely picked that measure for affordability to recognize that not every student is able to live at home for free and commute, which seems to be a popular opinion among policymakers when you ask them how we can make college more affordable. And we want to acknowledge that that's not the reality for many of our students, or if they are living at home, with their parents or in a multi-generational house, that they're expected to be working to contribute to the family income. So based on that measure, we have found first over the last 3 years that affordability is decreasing nationwide. And for the most recent data, that for a student who is attending a public in-state institution and living on campus for a bachelor's degree, that only 25% of the institutions nationwide are affordable. And for community colleges, that just under half of institutions are affordable, because what we see as you probably know for your institutions, at most or at many community colleges, the cost of living expenses are actually higher than the tuition expenses, and that most policymaking right now is focusing on affordable tuition and not full wraparound cost of living, which Ayman just shared his story about the struggles in that area. So that is why we are focused on doubling the Pell Grant so that students can cover not only their tuition and fees, but have funds left to contribute towards the cost of living.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Cherly, to you as well, same question. Why is there a need to increase the maximum award of Pell?
I think Ayman and Carrie pretty much explained the overall of the reason, but I want to put a little bit of, as far as what I'm seeing, especially in community college. So we often see a student has gap, meaning the Pell is not enough to cover the tuition, and sometimes that negatively impacts the academic performance, because sometimes we have students calling in for a flat tire or for them to be able to pay their FBL bill, or even basic internet. Yes, during the pandemic, we had some assistance, but some of those systems are long gone. So we have students that are in deep need of the very basic need in order for them to succeed. And unfortunately, although the tuition, like Carrie explained, are affordable, but the cost that, because of this rising cost of everything, of food, of computers or internet, and all of that are increasing. Therefore, it's limiting the student to be academically successful in classes. So in addition to Pell, we had to find ways to partner with community leaders and even advocate with the state, try to get some funding because the Pell isn't enough. The Pell is not rising enough to be able to sustain the cost of living for these students. So we often have to figure out some ways or the other to combine the Pell with some sort of other great grant, but some students cannot. They have to get loans, which we try to eliminate, trying to refrain the student to do because of anything, because their students are, especially now in the remote environment, we have students that are single parents that are trying to get even though they're not paying expenses for childcare, but prior to that, they had to pay expenses for childcare. So there's a lot of different expenses that pile up outside of tuition that Pell, if not increase, will limit the student capability to perform well. And they have to worry about, okay, am I going to be able to, is my internet going to cut off today? Am I able to do some research? Or am I able to even keep the light on to be able to perform well? Or gas, like Ayman was saying, like, am I able to even, can I go to campus? Even if to get the assistance from the library, can I go to campus? Public transportation, these are all costs that accumulate that the Pell, unfortunately, is not, the increase have not been significant to assist with all these costs.
Thank you very much, Shirley. And that's a very, very valuable point. Like, yes, we've seen increases over the past couple of years to keep up with inflation, but unfortunately, cost of living continue to rise at a higher rate than inflation at times. So there is a significant need. For the next round of questions, I'm going to ask each of you a different question tailored to your perspective that you're providing here. And we'll start with Carrie. We'll start with you this time around. How would increasing the maximum award of Pell make higher education more accessible to underrepresented populations in higher education?
Thank you. Well, I think we've touched on the how, and Shirley's the financial aid administrator, so I'll let her talk about the financial aid packaging, because that's the very literal how answer that you can give. I'm going to go a little broader here and mention, when we ask our students to tell this story, which we will be doing during our annual Thankful for Pell Week, the week before Thanksgiving, we're asking them to say, I'm thankful for Pell because with double Pell, I could, kind of like a fill in the blank exercise. And, some of the answers we're starting to hear are, I could work fewer hours a week, or I could have fewer jobs, and which would allow me to spend more time studying. I could pursue internships and maybe not have to worry about the paycheck quite as much, though NCAN supports paid interns. But there's an internship opportunity there. We also talk a lot about childcare. That's I think, as all panelists here are parents, so we know that even during COVID, that's an even more complicated conversation. But even before COVID, childcare was a major issue, both accessing it, but also being able to pay for it. So there are just a lot of ways where we can more holistically support students if they have better flexibility with their funds, so that they can focus on school and not have school be an afterthought because they need to cover all of these other basic needs first. Like, the basic needs should be there so that they can focus on school.
Thank you very much, Carrie. And you're right. If there's one thing that this pandemic has shown us is students are not able to enroll because the basic needs are not being met, whether it's as a result of a pandemic or because of other factors that are impacting us right now. Our basic needs for students are not being met, and that is making education not be a priority. You can't prioritize education if you have to worry about where you're going to sleep or what you're going to eat. You did also mention something. I think that this is a great transition for Shirley. Shirley, the next question is going to be for you. What financial challenges do you witness students having? And can you talk about how those challenges may have changed as a result of the pandemic?
Yes, so prior to the pandemic, some of the challenge, like I mentioned earlier, were mostly the basic cost of living. Those were the ones that were challenging. And even sometimes outside of the cost of living test, like for instance, you have some career-centered program like healthcare and paramedic, criminal justice. Those are things that, for instance, students are, in addition to the basic living, they need assistance trying to get some, like with the test and stuff like that. Another for them, because some of the tests are not, they're not cheap. They're quite expensive. So therefore, there is some of that. And like Carrie mentioned, some program limit them to work. They can't work. And therefore, in addition, again, the cost of attendance, like I said, is room and board. So that also is a challenge for some of the students to be able to successfully maintain a good academic record. Now, after the pandemic, yes, we had the CARES Act, which assisted some of our students, but that was for a very limited time. Therefore, students that are enrolled in the summer and enroll in the fall, they're still are faced with challenges and greater challenges now because there are everything is still rising, unfortunately. Although they may have, like for instance, they have not much of a childcare to go to currently, but they still, some of the things that I'm hearing from students is healthcare. They're concerned about their health. They're concerned about health insurance because some of them, they have to pay for some of the health insurance as well too. In addition to that, they're concerned about the housing, how to pay for housing because some of them are lost their jobs or a family member had passed away. Therefore, there's so many challenges as it relates to, yes, we're still providing the award letters with the packaging, but the cost of attendance, again, we give them the federal Pell, we try to refrain the student to borrow because we don't want them to accumulate debt. Therefore, we're trying to substantiate with state grant or institutional grant, but it's still not enough. It's still not enough because a student may get the maximum Pell, for instance, but what we're seeing is most for our average cost students that are in the 19 years old and 23 years old, or even older, that are more challenged because they have other expenses. Now we look at it, we do a survey every year to see the cost of attendance, and we keep seeing that increase all the time. And after the pandemic, it's gonna increase even further. So the challenge is pretty much what we said earlier, is mostly like the cost of living it's really has spiked. Additional costs that some people didn't think about before, now they have to worry about that. It was not a concern prior to the pandemic. Now they have to worry about that. Sometimes they lost an income in the household. So therefore they're not able to sustain some of these expenses. So the maximum Pell will definitely assist those students, especially I would say my average student, the one that's right in the middle, not at the cusp, not at the high top, but right in the middle. Those are the students that truly are in greater need. So with an increase, they are significantly, their aid gap are covered because they have that, they're able to sustain that cost, to pay for the higher cost of living. So mostly what we're seeing is our average cost of Pell, right in the middle of the grid, not the high or the low, but right in the middle. We have a lot of our students, especially in our college, that has a greater need for those students that fall within the average cost of Pell.
Thank you, Shirley. And you're right. If there was a need to increase the maximum award before, there certainly is now. Ayman, last question for this round is for you. And hopefully, I think you've already started making references to this already, but can you tell us how much of your college costs did your Pell Grant actually cover, and what did you have to do to fill in the gaps?
Yeah, so for the 2018-2019 academic year, I was awarded $6,095 for my Pell Grant. That year, the annual tuition and fees cost at UC Irvine was on average $15,450. My Pell Grant only covered 39% of the cost. You must take into account that this was only for tuition and fees, and not including housing. The high cost of housing in Orange County. So that was during my 4-year, being at a 4-year. Now at community college, when I was in community college, I would receive on average about, if I recall correctly, it's a little bit over $1,000 a semester. So that would bring a total of $2,000 a year. But so a little bit more about myself. So I am a single father. So I had to provide for my family and I had to provide for myself, right? I had my dreams were to walk the stage of a 4-year university. So in order to do that, I had to work two jobs, two full-time jobs. I worked one full-time job being your local delivery boy, pizza delivery boy. I used to work for Domino's Pizza. I used to put in about 35 hours there, and then I had a full-time job at a local hospital, like in the kitchen. I was working 40 hours there, so in total I was working about 75 hours a week, not every 2 weeks. So, and then in my only day off, I will go to school. I will go to school either at night or in the morning, whatever time my schedule allowed. But by doing that, that took away a lot of time from my studying. So I would study like between my breaks. Being a delivery boy, I would study between my deliveries. I would drop off the pizza and then take like 5 minutes to kind of review my notes, and I'll go like that to just study little by little. But I had to go to those extremes to get through community college and then venture out to a 4-year university. But I did have to go out of my way to work 2 jobs in order to cover my personal expenses, my housing expenses, my daughter's expenses, and school. I had to purchase books every semester, and books definitely when it comes down to science books, they're not cheap at all. So, but yeah, that's a little bit of how I filled in those gaps.
Thank you for sharing your story, Ayman. And you say science book, I would say any textbook for higher education these days is a lot. And that's really a really powerful story. And it shouldn't have to be that hard to obtain an education in this country, which is why we should increase the maximum award of Pell. For the next question that I have for you all, I'm going to ask you the same question, and I'm just ask you to take turns. Cherly, I'll start with you this time. What are the most important pieces of information that a trustee, as you know, most of the people in our audience today are trustees, are members. We do have folks from all over the DC as well. We even have some congressional staffers. Thank you for joining us. But what are some of the most important pieces of information that a trustee can share with legislators to push for an increase to Pell?
Okay, well, one of the things, I think we've pretty much touched on most of it, but one of the things I really want a trustee to remember is most of the time when we're looking at a Pell chart, we look at, okay, the student is already getting, let's say, $8,000 seems really high. But if you're looking at, for instance, for my institution, we're looking at the student that are working and are making $50,000 less, and their EFC is about, let's say, $2,100. So I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit technical, but what I'm trying to get to is when you are right in the middle of a Pell chart, like your EFC is not 0, or is it 5,000? You're right in the middle. Those students are the ones that are not getting as much as assistance. They are the ones that have the highest need for assistance. And whenever a maximum Pell Grant is increased, those students are getting most of what they need to cover gap. Because most of the time, when you're looking at it's like, oh my God, $8,000 or $15,000, whatever the case might be, well, it's a high amount. But if you really look at the students right in the middle of the chart, they're not really getting as much, especially for right now we're at 3,000 and higher. For Pell, they're not really getting as much assistance. Therefore, they are in greater need. They have the greater gap for assistance for cost of attendance. Although many institutions across the nation are low, or some of them has not increased their tuition for years, just to make sure the students doesn't have that barrier as it relates to going to college. Now, 4-year degree it's great for economic. It's great for the country. So if a student obtains a 4-year degree, it's putting back into the country, the workforce, back into the workforce. So I would say for me, coming from a community college, is to really think about, okay, what about those students that are true working, like Ayman had to do 2 jobs to sustain his family, and his EFC, I'm sure, was not zero. Therefore, he was right in the middle of that Pell chart. So he's not getting as much assistance. He had to work harder, but he was still had to sustain and get assistance. So if he didn't have to work that 2 job, had enough funding, if focused in school, he could go back into the market and get a sustained job to sustain for his family and have a good income. So whenever you put into a program, especially for Pell Grant, you get it back into the society. So I think that's one thing that for me, my takeaway is to really look at how increasing the Pell Grant would help our society and also the generations to come.
Thank you very much, Shirley. Ayman, I'll turn it over to you. Same question. What are the key pieces of information that trustees should share with their members when advocating for an increase to the maximum award?
Yeah, Shirley, thank you for sharing that. You hit it right on, especially for someone that went to community college and someone that serves students that will be attending community college. I think the amount of Pell Grant a student receives can be the determining factor if one decides to continue higher education. Once you receive those award letters and you start seeing the high cost to attend that school, that community college, or going off to a 4-year university, like that discourages students from continuing their education. I've had a lot of students sit down with me and tell me, "Mister, why should I go? Why should I go? I don't want to take on debt." Like, it shouldn't get to that point. It should not get to that point. Like I mentioned earlier, like, you must recognize, like, the cost of living has increased throughout the years, and the amount of Pell awarded to students has continually decreased. Like Jose said, since 1972. I highly encourage, trustees to prioritize, like the affordability and tuition setting policies with legislators. Like, we need to help students. We need to help meet students' financial needs. Nowadays, like I said, it's incredibly sad. It broke my heart having to sit down with families and going over their award letters, right? And then a lot of my students, their dream schools such as Berkeley or San Jose State, not being able to attend these schools, given that they were not receiving enough Pell Grant. And like Shirley said, it's those families that you in the middle, those families that earn on average $60,000, and a family of 3 or 4. But a lot of my students come from single parent homes. So, those families are the ones that their EFC is higher, so they're not receiving the sufficient enough aid to meet their financial needs. So definitely, I highly encourage you guys to start to continue advocating, to continue working with Congress to make a change, because the cost of living nowadays is ridiculous. And now, just with the pandemic, just what we're living right now. So that's even, I could just imagine all the studies that places like NCAN are going to be providing with this these unprecedented times. But yeah.
Thank you, Ayman. That's very, very true. And I think one thing that both you and Shirley have mentioned is, one message to get across is that not every Pell recipient is the same. Not everyone gets to have the maximum award of the Pell, but increasing the maximum award will also increase the amount of funds that all the other Pell recipients receive in the spectrum, in the chart. So it's critical to help the needs of those that have an EFC of 0 up to those that have an EFC of 5,000. Carrie, same question for you. What are the most important pieces of information that a trustee should share with legislators in order to advocate for an increase to the maximum award?
We always train our members to say you want a story and some statistics, because legislators, and particularly if you're meeting with a staffer, are looking for both. I think we've really moved into an era of policymaking where statistics and outcomes matter, but also, but you still need that human touch. So my recommendation for which statistics I would go in with are: one, the percentage of students on your campus who receive a Pell Grant. Two, what the percentage of cost of attendance that Pell covers at your institution. And this is a good opportunity to point out, one, that the cost of living and the supports that students need are usually the bigger barrier than the tuition. Or if you're in a state where community college is particularly expensive, it's also, you know, to maybe point out that the state hasn't been investing the way they should, because, you know, we want Congress to act, but we also want states to act as well. And members of Congress can certainly influence what's happening at the state level in their state. And then last, I would highlight the total number of Pell dollars that's coming in to the congressional district for that member of Congress, because then you get into the, like, you know, this isn't about federal spending. I know there's a question in the Q&A about Democrats versus Republicans, but it's about bringing home the bacon for your constituents, and that is something that still goes pretty broad across both sides of the aisle. So those are the statistics I would look at. And then I would make sure that you're talking with students and you have some, you know, some very specific examples. If you are able to include students in your meetings with legislatures, particularly in district, I highly encourage it. It's something that we're trying to expand as our advocacy. We have 66 student fellows serving with us this year that are just going to start next week, that I'm really excited about. So if you can include a student, great. But if you can't include a student, having some of those real life examples and knowing them personally, staffers are pretty good about whether you're talking in generalities or you actually know the person. And the last piece I would mention in terms of selecting which students you want to talk about is you want to select some students that represent a common experience on your campus. So one example outside of education, which I guess is a little dated now, but I think it's the strongest one, is that a couple years ago, there was a social media story that went viral about a gentleman who was walking 3 hours each way to his job in Detroit. And this made, I see heads nodding. So like this became a really well-known story. And it was very heartwarming. You know, one of the Detroit motor companies said, this is not okay. You know, they gave him a car. They're like this, you know, but the thing with his story and that extreme example is, okay, that individual got a car, which is great for him. But what didn't happen was a purposeful conversation about affordable transportation in the city of Detroit and how many people are probably going through similar difficult lengths to get to work, and how do we solve that? So we always challenge to look for, you know, don't find the really extreme example of a student where the legislator's like, I want to personally help that student, because then they're distracted from the overall policy goal. You want them to hear that lots of students need help, and the only way we can do that is systemic change.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. All those are great tips. I was writing notes myself about what I should be taking when I advocate for this next Congress. Now we're going to turn over to the audience Q&A, and we do have a couple of questions. I'm going to go not by order of receipt, but by order of how many have received more thumbs up, which tells me that the audience really wants to hear from this. And for this part, I'm going to ask the question and pose the question generally to the three of you, and feel free to jump in and answer where you see fit. The first one is, what are the prospects of a Pell increase in the next year in light of possible political changes? How can community college leaders best advocate for Pell increases when talking to Democrats versus Republicans?
I touched on this a little bit, so I'm happy to dive in first. You know, there are definitely some differences, particularly if you look at the presidential party platform. I will stand by that, saying how many Pell dollars is coming into the district, particularly for staffers, is good on both sides of the aisle. I think what I also hear from both sides, even sometimes from Democrats, is, well, how are we going to pay for that? So that's something, that's something that is a slightly more complicated answer. But so I would be ready for that question. And I would say it goes, there is research that shows the Pell Grant investment pays for itself. Well, I don't remember the exact number, but many times over because of the tax income that's recouped. So that's usually the direction I go there. Vice President Biden has double Pell in his platform. So the conversation with Democrats, should he win, is going to be very different. I think the conversation with Republicans requires to touch on how, something like a federal state partnership or other mechanisms to try to control the cost. So usually the biggest pushback I hear from Republican lawmakers is, yes, we support Pell and we understand the increased need, but what happens when we increase Pell and then the cost of college just goes up? And I think there's some strong data looking back that the cost of college has risen way faster than the Pell investment. So I don't necessarily see those as a one-to-one relationship. But second, that we don't want to encourage states to divest their federal investment, and that's why we need to create something like a federal state partnership that allows for them. But there are some differences, but I think overall, most lawmakers are concerned about their constituents, and they just need to hear those stories. And that particularly for lawmakers who have maybe gone to college quite a lot of years ago, a couple decades ago, really explaining the today's student story is important.
Thank you for sharing, Carrie, and that's the reality. And ACCT is a nonpartisan association. We advocate on these issues to both Democrats and Republicans. We do take different approaches, much like Carrie said. They have different areas where they like to focus, but one thing we always say is this is an investment and it will pay off. And in fact, there's research out there that proves that a federal state partnership or college promise programs, which we've seen crop up over the past decade in several states, do eventually pay themselves off, with more students having higher wages and in turn providing an increased tax base for states and for the federal government. So that's another angle to always, of course, tackle. I'll go over to their next question. At Capitol Hill, representatives want to hear the student perspectives of what we're advocating for. How can student trustees represent their students' voices most effectively to the officials at Capitol Hill? And what are questions for student trustees to consider when advocating for increased Pell initiative?
Okay, I'm going to try to tackle that one. So as it relates to student trustees, they are very much involved within their student body. So I think their voices are, they really represent the overall, like many different background, socioeconomic of students. So they really represent the voice. So I think having a student trustee represent a student from each of their institution would be efficient to legislator to really understand not just the numbers, but the student, like the human touch, how can that increase of Pell truly help a student? Like how currently it is impacting their decision, not only financially, but education, because the whole purpose of a Pell is to make sure they have a degree. It's for them to make sure they have a good academic, for them to go on and to the workforce. Therefore, to have a student trustee just really gather all the information from the core student body just to present it to Congress, I think it's a great idea. Each institution is different because each institution will have a different question from there, but the common one, I'm sure, as we all have been saying throughout this discussion, is the cost of living. Yes, and like Carrie said, yes, they always look at one-to-one, the cost of attendance and the tuition, but many institutions has not even raise their tuition for over 10 years, just to make sure they keep at bay the cost of attendance or trying to alleviate the gap that the students are faced with. So I think for each institution is a bit different, just to have, like, I would say, do a survey, trying to obtain some more information from the student core, try to understand what type of question, because each institution is different as far as what their student perspective would be.
Thank you, Shirley. And if I could add one more thing to answer that question is, as a student trustee, you have a seat at the table. You are able to meet with your representative, which not every student gets the opportunity to do. So you have the opportunity to amplify the voices of those who are not in the room with you. And you have friends, right? You have friends who come from different backgrounds, who may be at an EFC of 0, who may be at an EFC of 5,000, who may be somewhere in between. And much to what Carrie said, congressional staff and members can tell if you're speaking in generalities versus if you're sharing an actual story. And there's nothing more powerful than providing the story of your friends, of your peers, who may not be getting the same resources as you, or who may be getting more resources than you because they have a different background, and then backing that up with the data. And the data is there. You just have to tell them, like, these are the people who you're not seeing who are being impacted. We have one more question in the queue, but I do know that we are already at 3 p.m. So I'll ask it, and if you all can provide a very brief response, I'm not sure how brief this can be. I'm sure the audience would appreciate it, and then after that, we'll close out. What specific policy proposals should we advocate for this Congress, or ask congressional members to introduce? So what specific proposals should we be advocating for, I guess, going into next Congress, since this one only has a month, 2 months left, or asking members to introduce if it's not already out there? I'll start with the easiest one: increase the maximum award of Pell.
And Jose, I'll jump on that with the only having a month left of Congress. And sure, maybe this is where you were going, but Congress hasn't actually set the Pell Grant for fiscal year 21 yet. Right now, they did a continuing resolution to keep the government funded through December 11th. So if you really meant this Congress, and you are like excited to do something right away, we at the very least want to see the inflationary adjustment. Those are not automatic. Congress has to do those every year. So there's a really prime opportunity right now before December 11th, when Congress has to finish the fiscal year 21 funding to advocate for the Pell Grant that will be the Pell Grant for next fall.
I also just wanted to add on, also, focusing on those policies that affect reincarcerated students, allowing them to be eligible for the Pell Grant. I feel that's really important, and we should heavily focus on that. But yeah, I'll allow Shirley to share, or anyone else given it.
I would say, and I'm a strong advocate for that outside, is like to strengthen the need-based aid. So I would say, one, that to me, that is crucial for a student. I see how it goes a long way for students. So I would say, in addition to what Carrie and Ayman mentioned, is to advocate for that. I mean, to introduce back on the table as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, all three of you, for your input. Carrie, you are absolutely right. The Pell Grant increase is not a guarantee. Each and every year we have to fight and talk to appropriators to make sure that we do get a cost of rate of inflation increase, which is what we're advocating, what's in the FY20 funding bill, which again, it has not passed, has not been finalized. They have a December 11 deadline. And amen to what you said. Yes, this webinar is focused on increasing the maximum award of Pell, but ACCT has a general priority to strengthen the Pell Grant program. That includes making incarcerated students eligible for Pell. That includes making short-term Pell actually enacted into law, so that students that want to engage in other short-term programs are able to access those funds as well. and of course, increasing the maximum award of Pell, and in addition to that, increasing other forms of federal need-based aid that students have available right now, but that are, like our presentation mentioned earlier, not meeting the needs of students today. This brings our webinar to a close today. Thank you everyone for joining us. And like Jihang mentioned, we do have 2 more, one on November 12th, one on December 3rd. We hope you can join us then. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for such a very riveting discussion and for sharing your stories and sharing your perspective. I hope everyone that joined us was able to get something out of this and who hopefully feel more confident in being an advocate for increasing the maximum award of Pell, whether it be in this last 2 months of the 116th Congress or in the next Congress as we gear up for the 117th. Thank you all and have a good afternoon.